recently sold my 986 Boxster on Cars and Bids and bought a GR86 instead. In this video, I'll explain why and compare the cars based on performance, cost, practicality, reliability, and the overall vibe of the car. But before I dive into the comparison, I want to defend why I think these two cars should be compared at all. Most comparison videos usually pit the 86 against the 987 Boxster and Cayman, specifically the second gen 987.2S. On the surface, that makes sense. Assuming you get a Cayman with a manual transmission, which by the way is the one you want, you're looking at the mid to high 30s for a good spec. That's basically what you'll pay for a new GR86 premium in California. So it seems like a natural cross shop, but that doesn't tell the whole picture. It ignores the Cayman's cost of ownership and the work you may need to do to refresh the car and make it feel like new. You'll probably need to do spark plugs, drive belt, fluids, brakes, rotors, and maybe the clutch if that's ran its course. That's all gonna push you to the mid 40s. But if you have a higher budget and you're not anxious about an out of warranty Porsche, well then the Cayman's simply a better car than the 86. You get a howling flat six, you get better power to weight, you get mid-engine balance, you get hydraulic steering, a higher limit on track. Whether it's more fun on a canyon road is debatable, and I'd like to test that out personally. So if you're in or around LA and you have a 987.2 Cayman S, hit me up. But with all that aside, I believe the 986 and the GR86 are a closer performance-based comparison. The cost of the two also start to converge when you factor in some mods. So let's dive into it. First, performance. There are a couple of things that factor into performance. There's power to weight, suspension, chassis feel, weight balance, steering, braking, and then handling overall. First, power to weight. We're looking at around 156 horsepower per ton for the base 2.7 liter 986 Boxster, and 172 horsepower per ton for the Boxster S. The 86 is right in the middle at about 161 horsepower per ton. Now factor in the horsepower loss for a car that's 2 decades old, and you're looking at a very similar power to weight between the 86 and the Boxster S. Suspension. The GR86 has oodles more road compliance, which is unsurprising given the Bilsteins and the decades-old gap between the cars. Its suspension is also far less crashy and body rolly. My 986 was 25 years old and had pretty awful damping. It felt crashy over bumps and potholes, and it pitched more than I'd like on turn-in. Overall, the Boxster suspension could have used a refresh, but for occasional spirited canyon driving, I found it was manageable. If you have particularly shitty roads where you live, get coilovers sooner rather than later. You'll get a performance edge over stock, and you can adjust the damping to your preference. But comparing stock to stock, the GR86 wins in suspension. Chassis feel. Once again, the GR86 wins. The car has more structural rigidity over the 986 Boxster. We're talking 2 decades of chassis engineering between the two and a roof, so the difference in rigidity is not too surprising. And on that point, the 86's rigidity contributes to why it feels like it's on rails, but chassis flex is really something you'd feel more significantly in higher force corners on track, and less so on the canyon roads. So with some suspension upgrades on the Boxster, you could likely close the gap in cornering feel in the canyons for the two cars. Weight balance. They're about the same. Both cars are virtually 50-50, with the 986 having a slight rear bias and the GR86 having a slight front bias, given the relative location of their engines. A mid-engine configuration for the Boxster technically means more grip on the rear tires, because that's where the weight is. You theoretically also get better balance and more power to the road during acceleration, but critically, the 86's front engine configuration means less grip on the rear, which makes it easier to drift. Drifting is fun. Steering. The 986 is the clear winner in steering. It's got a hydraulic rack instead of EPS, which is precise and well weighted. The GR86 is also precise and controllable, but gives you far less road feedback compared to the 986's steering. As a result, you're not as aware of how your tires are interacting with the road surface. So if you're on a banked road or turning over a pothole, for example. Braking. Both cars are pretty underwhelming stock when it comes to braking. But if you had to compare them, the 86 is better out of the box. You can upgrade brakes on either car for relatively cheap. You could add some pads, and if you want, add rotors as well, and that'll transform the braking on both cars. Looking at handling overall, the 86 wins. It feels absolutely planted around a bend because of the better suspension and chassis. And the 86 is also more tail happy than the 986, which makes it far more compelling. Life is short, and rear wheel drive cars are meant to slide around. So why do I consider the cars comparable if the GR86 wins in most of the performance categories? That's because if you buy a 986, you get a big mods budget, which brings us to cost. Here are some estimates based on cars and bids and bring a trailer. As you can see, buying a 986 gives you about 15 to 20K to play with. Even assuming you have to do clutch and IMS, let's call that 7K, you'll still have 8 to 13K to spend on brakes, tires, coilovers, pipes, intake, an ECU tube. And for the record, I think the IMS bearing fears for the 986 are way overblown. A high mileage model that's had the snot driven out of it is likely in the clear. And if you buy a 986 with close to 100K miles, maybe someone's even gone ahead and replaced the clutch for you. Where things may get a little trickier is maintenance. I handled all the maintenance for the 986 with my dad and uncle, who's a mechanic. That means I didn't have to pay Porsche maintenance prices, which for a car long out of warranty, it can add up for someone who's not really handy with a wrench. So between the mods you need to do to close the gap between the 986 and the GR86, as well as the increased maintenance costs, you can see how the real costs of ownership start to converge between the two cars. Practicality and livability. If you're in your 20s and you don't have a kid, drive a Roadster. Full stop. You're gonna figure the rest out, okay? And the 986 has some of the fewest compromises as a Roadster. It has a big frunk and a trunk. And the trunk is big enough to throw hockey gear in the back, and you can put your sticks in the cabin, right? It does decent fuel economy at around 21 to 23 miles per gallon combined. And the manual transmission was easy even during trafficy commutes. The clutch felt just right. It was a little heavier than in most modern cars, but I personally prefer that because you get better feel and a very intuitive point of engagement. If you have a hilly commute though, it can start to be a pain in the ass because the car doesn't come with hill assist. So that's just something you should factor in. So what are the cons for the 986? Biggest one for me was the high NVH from wind and road noise, combined with the bad noise insulation from the soft top. It can be way too loud in the cabin to take phone calls on speaker, and long commutes on the freeway will drive you nuts if you're sensitive to sound. And more obviously, the lack of a rear seat can get pretty annoying. I did whatever I could to convince my wife to keep the 986, but with the newborn on the way, it was a losing battle. Right? You can technically disable the airbag in the passenger seat, and you fit in a brace to hold the rear-facing car seat. But setting that hassle aside, there was a bunch of other reasons to sell the car. Right? The first one being the 25-year gap in safety tech. Second, the likelihood of decapitation for me and the baby if we got hit on the freeway by a truck. And the fact that even if we could safely put a car seat in the passenger seat, my wife couldn't drive the car in case of emergency if I had taken our family car, which for those interested, it's a 6th gen 4Runner. She can't drive manual. Maybe someday when we're retired and leathery, she'll let me teach her. But until then, the second car in the garage also has to be an auto. The GR86, by comparison, solves basically every single one of those issues. I can fit a rear-facing car seat in the back, though it basically cancels out the passenger seat. It's just the driver and the baby. But it has a roof. It has modern safety tech. It has a spacious trunk. I average around 27 miles per gallon. The NVH is high, but not nearly as high as in the 986. It has built-in CarPlay. It has a far less punishing ride, and my wife can drive it because it's auto. As enthusiasts, we harp on automatic transmissions all the time, but the car is seriously fun, even in an auto. And the paddles are good enough to make you feel engaged. No one should be deterred from getting this car because they need to buy an automatic. And a quick point on this as well. If you're doing your own maintenance, engine access for the 86 is obviously a lot easier than in the Boxster, which requires you to open the clamshell, unhook the soft top cables, take out the storage and heat shields. It's a total pain. Reliability. So I'll keep this one short. Both the 986 and the GR86 have some issues that have been covered ad nauseum on forums and other videos. The 986 has the IMS bearing issue, which again, isn't as big of an issue as everyone who's never owned one seems to think. Don't let that deter you if you're buying a high mileage car. The GR86 has the oil starvation and RTV issue. If you're tracking the car regularly in high temps, buy an oil cooler and check the forums on how much you should preemptively overfill engine oil for track days. Regarding RTV, you can drop your oil pan to clean silicone residue if you're an anxious person, but chances are with canyon driving and occasional tracking, that's not going to pose any issues for these cars. The bottom line is both are reliable sports cars. The issue is that all 986 Boxsters are decades old. So parts get worn, rubber hoses dry, plastics crack, etc. But for what it's worth though, which I guess is not all that much, I put about 10,000 miles on my 986 and never had a single issue. If you're scared of owning an old car, even a fairly reliable one, then maybe the GR86 is right for you. Vibes. The vibes in an old Roadster are stratospheric, and the 986 is no exception. The flat six is a complete joy with the top down, and in the mountains, at canyon speeds, the car really rewards your senses. The GR86, while it's so engaging behind the wheel, obviously insulates you more than in a convertible. The car doesn't sound particularly good stock, but in exchange, you get to slide around like a goon. The 86 is a lot more diabolical than the 986, especially when traction's off, but in like a predictable non-BMW turbo way. It's not gonna make your wife a widow. Both cars are pretty, but shockingly, I prefer the look of the GR86 over the 986. The iconic Porsche silhouette turns more heads though, if that's your thing. Overall, I'd say the vibes are higher in the 986, but they're harder to access. They depend on the road, the vistas, the weather, if you're able to persuade your passenger to put the top down. The thrills from the GR86, on the other hand, are easier to access, and you're excited to drive it every time you sit in the car. Okay, so the question of the video, which one should you buy? If you're not a dad and are optimizing vibes instead of performance, get the 986. But even then, maybe the Miata's the better choice because it's new and it weighs less. But for everyone else that's shopping in the mid-30s, consider an 86. You won't be disappointed.